Open our Bibles tonight to Esther chapter 9. Begin reading with, I'm not going to read all of the verses. One, I'm going to save my voice. Two, I went way overtime this morning. I was reminded of that. So I preached less than 2 hours. I didn't think that was too bad. My wife and I have some friends that go to another church, believes pretty much like we do, but if their preacher preaches under an hour, they feel like they're getting out, they've missed something. He didn't preach an hour or more today, so we didn't get a full sermon. I don't ever want you to leave here saying that we needed more, we didn't get enough. So every once in a while, I will keep you on your toes, and not very often, but at least occasionally. For the sake of my voice and the sake of time, we're not going to read all of these verses in the beginning, but we will read quite a few of them as we go through. The title is Turning Defeat unto or into victory. We've waited a very long time for this day to arrive. Almost a year has passed since wicked Haman, first passed the law that every Jew was to be killed. Almost a year, Jews have had this cloud hanging over them that you're going to die. Then we saw the tide begin to turn, and the Babylonians were now living under the cloud of, we could die in this situation. So the Jews probably felt that their troubles were more than they could possibly survive. How on earth is God going to overturn this? How on earth can God possibly save us? And I know God said we're going to get the victory. I know God said that He will go with us. I just don't see how He's going to do it. Well, I understand how the Jews may have felt. There have been many, many, many times in my ministry that I have had things happen that I felt there's no way to survive this. There's no way to survive this, and there's no way to be victorious. Now, I'm not going to go through 54 years of ministry and all the different times that I thought I was done, I thought I was dead, I thought I was over, I thought my ministry was finished, at least with the church I was at that time. So I fully understand how the Jews may have felt. I know God's in control, but I just can't understand how God is going to solve this problem. But things are different now. Haman, that old wicked Haman, has been exposed and hanged on the very gallows he built for Mordecai. Haman is gone. He's off the scene. No longer is he in charge. Mordecai is now in charge, and the Jews have a little more reason to be optimistic. There's a glimmer of hope. Let's see where it leads. In verses 1 through 4, we find out that the tide begins to turn. Esther, Mordecai, and all the wise men had developed a plan for the Jews not to be annihilated. We looked at that last week, and I'm not going to repeat all of it, but under Haman's law, the Jews were not permitted to fight back against their enemies. The army would make sure of that. If you even thought about fighting back, the army was there to make sure you did not fight back. You don't even assemble to think about fighting back. But under Mordecai's law, the Jews were allowed to assemble and to fight back in self-defense. They were allowed to assemble. Under Haman, they were not even allowed to assemble. They were allowed to fight. Under Haman, they were not allowed to even own any weapons that could be used to fight back. And so under Haman, they really truly were almost destroyed. But under Mordecai, things begin to change. Now, needing permission to assemble may sound strange to us. Every one of you are here tonight. How many of you got pulled over by the police? I don't mean speeding, but on the way here, and they ask, "Where are you going?" "I'm going to church." You're under arrest because you're not allowed to assemble. In China, if they catch you at church, you are arrested and very probably will be killed. In other countries, they forbid, unless you are a member of the state authorized church, you are forbidden to assemble. Oh, but we live in America. How many of you remember COVID? Almost all of you. If that were to happen now, I would do things a whole lot differently. The government said, you cannot assemble. Many churches, the majority of churches, did not even assemble for a year or more because the government said, we cannot assemble. Now, we roped off every other pew, made everybody sit 6 feet apart. I don't think I would even do that today. But we think, oh, that can't happen in America. It did happen. And many churches went along with it. Did you know up until a few years ago, you were not permitted to defend yourself against an attacker? Now, almost all states allow a person the right to self-defense. Now, we think, oh, that's ridiculous. You go back a few years and find out where somebody acted in self-defense. Who ended up in prison? It wasn't the thief. It wasn't the rapist. It wasn't the attempted murderer. It was the individuals who practiced self-defense. The government in almost every state said you do not have the right to defend yourself against a rapist, mugger, robber, even a murderer, the government said you do not have the right to defend yourself. How many of y'all remember that? Okay, a few of you are old enough to remember that. It explains a little bit of why the Jews felt doomed, because they were not allowed to assemble. They were not allowed to act in self-defense. In our case, self-defense now is so rooted in our Constitution that it's hard to remember when in most states you would be arrested if you killed somebody that broke into your house and was trying to rape your wife or your daughter. You would be arrested. It's hard for us to remember that. Some of you aren't old enough to remember that. Under Mordecai's law, they were free to assemble. They were free to defend themselves. Now, God was going to give them the victory, but they still had to fight. Now, there are religions, and in case you're wondering, I'm not one of them. They believe if somebody breaks into my house and grab my wife, try to rape her, or actually rape her, cut her up in little pieces, torture her, I'm just supposed to stand there and say, the Lord's will be done. There are religions where the man of the house will not defend himself nor his family. I am not one of those. Not at all. I believe God can protect me. I keep my guardian angel so busy. He applied for vacation and God said, you don't have time for vacation. That Wilbert Ellis is such a pain. You can't leave his sight for a minute. No, God gives the victory. But we do have to do our part. I remember years ago, a family was in dire financial need. The husband was out of work. The wife couldn't work. And I said, hey, I know a place over here that's hiring. If you want to go and apply, they are hiring. And his answer was, and I said, forget it. You're not getting one red penny out of me. He said, if the Lord wants me to have a job, he'll bring it to me. And it's like, you're going to starve to death and I'm not going to feel sorry for you. When I was out of work, I knew God would find me a job. But I was out there every day looking, filling out applications. I worked as a busboy at a restaurant. If there's such a thing as a horrible, low-down, rotten, stinking, dirty job, it's a busboy in a restaurant. Now, the servers do a lot of that today. Back then, if somebody threw up all over the floor, guess who got to clean it up? If somebody threw their food on the floor, guess who got to clean it up? It was a dirty, lousy, stinking job. But you know what? I was looking for work, and God provided that job until I got a much better job later. But I never had trouble finding a job because I was willing to work anywhere under almost any circumstances. Well, God will provide God will take, what was it? My God shall supply all your need. Yeah, but as Bill brought out this morning, there were some conditions that had to be met. And God's going to give me a job, yeah, but He's not going to let you lay on the couch and watch TV all day and somebody call up and say, hey, I've got an office job paying $200,000 a year. Are you interested? It ain't going to happen. The Jews were going to win, but they had to be willing to fight. With Mordecai in charge, the enemies of the Jews began switching sides. For months, the enemy had said, I'm counting the days till I can cut your throat out. I'm counting the days till I can cut your heart out. And they had the army to back them up. Now with Mordecai in charge, that same army is now going to be fighting for the Jews because Mordecai is in charge. And now the enemy, the Jews are saying, I remember when you threatened to cut my heart out. Come the 13th of December, I'm going to cut your heart out. Situation completely reversed. All because of a change in leadership. From Haman to Mordecai. The Jews were now free to gather together. And with Mordecai in charge, if you oppose him, he's got the entire army behind him. And it's like, oh, you dare not follow orders? Court-martial him. And you would have been court-martialed, or worse, you would have been killed for insubordination. Now, I'm going to, and I've really tried throughout this lesson not to get too deep into politics, but having grown up around the army, having seen the army from a civilian's point of view, but yet very involved in having a lot of soldiers in our church, with Dad working at the hospital in the army base, I knew a lot of soldiers. And one thing I learned is when the general gives an order to the major gives the order to the colonel gives the order to the captain gives it to the lieutenant gives it to the sergeant gives it to the private. And what do you think that private does? I know what he better do. Because I remember hearing a general's wish is a private's command. There's a chain of command that when it gets down to the bottom, you will either follow orders or you will be court-martialed. My uncle, well, I had a couple of uncles in the military, but one uncle, he made I think he was a 20, 25, 30-year career man. He would make several stripes, get up, sergeant, wherever. And then somebody would do something he didn't like, and he would flat cuss out the lieutenant, cuss out the captain. He would be court-martialed, sentenced to so many days in the brig, stripped of all of his stripes. He would get out, work his way up, get a few stripes, chew out a captain, lieutenant, lost his stripes, back to the brig. He spent 30 years doing that same exact pattern over and over. And when he retired, he still didn't know that you don't cuss out your lieutenant and captain. You don't cuss out your superiors. You would think as many times as he was court-martialed and demoted, somewhere he would have learned the lesson. He never learned. Till the day he retired, he never learned. One of the things that is so vital in the Army is the adherence to rules and regulations. Well, I don't understand why the general told the major who told the captain, the colonel who told the captain, who told the lieutenant, who told the sergeant, who told me. I don't know why the general gave that order in the first place, so I'm not going to follow it. Well, we know in the Army what happens. Do you know there are people in churches who have that same attitude? Well, I don't care what that preacher says. He can't make me. No, you're right. I can't. I'm not going to come back there with a bullwhip and whip you and say, you're going to do it. No, all I can do is turn you over to God and say, God, you know their heart. You know their condition. You know their rebellion. You know their stubbornness. Lord, I can't make them do anything. But I can go to the lieutenant, who goes to the captain, who goes to the colonel, who goes to the major, who goes to the general. And you know what? I can't make you do anything. But God can put you in a position to where He can make you do things. Now, the other thing is, I was thinking of this, and partially because I just read some articles this past week. When an officer, and I'm talking about a very high-ranking officer, retires from his branch of service, runs for the Senate in D.C., is elected to the Senate, and he's still part of the Army, even though at that high rank, you're still subject to recall. And then he goes national and tells all the troops in every branch of the military, Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, what's the other one? Coast Guard. He goes on TV and says, you do not have to obey the commander-in-chief. And now he's mad because they're thinking about demoting him. They're thinking about reactivating and court-martialing him. And everybody's saying, oh, that's just so terrible. That's so mean. He made the decision to openly defy the commander-in-chief. Now, I don't agree with our president on everything. In fact, I don't agree with him on several things. But he is still the president. He is still elected by our nation to be the leader of our country. And though I don't agree, and I can write my congressman, I do. I can write my senators, I do. And I can say when this comes to a vote, please vote it down. But I'm not going to go to D.C. and say, I'm going to kill that president because I don't like the way he did something. I would be an absolute idiot to try. Now, having said all of that, the Army understood Haman is now in charge of the military. I don't know if they liked Haman or not. Bible doesn't say. But they were afraid enough that they dared not contradict Haman and without knowing the consequences. Well, in verse 5 through 11, God gives the victory. They did what they would to those that hated them. I know there's a big debate, not by anybody I know, but I read about it. I like to know what's going on, so I read several magazines, newspapers, articles. There are people in America who believe you should be prosecuted if you act in self-defense. You should turn the other cheek. First of all, they're taking that verse out of context, which always bugs me. There are people who do not believe in self-defense. I got news. I will turn the other cheek as far as possible. But when it comes to defending my family, my wife, my daughter, my daughters-in-law, my grandkids, I will die fighting to the last breath to defend my family and, for that matter, my friends. Somebody's beaten up on any of you all. I remember when I was first in training with the police department, as a civilian, we were not allowed to carry a gun on us. So I remember one of the first classes we went through, they're telling us what to expect, what to do if this happens, if that happens. And the guy who was teaching looked at me and said, "What would you do if the officer you're riding with is under attack? They've got him down, they've got him pinned down, and they're fixing to kill him. What would you do?" And I said, I would look for the biggest stone, the biggest rock, the biggest, what's it called? Those things that come out the side of trees. What are they? Branch, thank you. I said, I would look for the biggest thing I could find and smack them over the head. He said, that's why you cannot carry a gun. We were told if your officer is down, and the first thing when I got in the cruiser, first thing I learned is where the shotgun is and how to unlatch it and which end points out and which end is supposed to go which direction. Because in a tight bind, we were expected to defend the officer we were with. It was your brother-in-law is a state trooper. No? Oh, he's with ATF now. Oh. You've got too many people in law enforcement. But anyway, you've ridden with them. You know the routine. My first instinct is to not get in the middle of a fight. But if it comes to defending the officer I'm with, we had full rights to do whatever we had to do to protect ourselves and to protect the officer. Self-defense. If somebody broke in and started shooting, if they survived, y'all know what I mean by that. If they survived, you know what I'm going to be doing? I'm going to be doing everything I can to get you all out of here, and then I will deal with him personally But my first goal is to protect you all, to get you all out safely. Either that, or we talked about putting a bulletproof shield and ducking down, but they would eventually find me and I would be gone anyway. My point is, they were allowed to defend themselves and their families. God gave the victory. But they did what they could to those that had already expressed hatred toward them. Oh, that sounds cruel and vindictive. It's not when you think about what those people were fixing to do to the Jews. His history, if we can believe history, these people were a bunch of mean, vicious, cruel people who would have done anything to torture the Jews and eventually kill them. They were not some bunch of quilt-making old women doing nice things for other people, and the Jews just went in and slaughtered them. They were soldiers, they were neighbors who were so full of hate and bitterness. History tells us that they were mean, vicious murderers. They would take a pregnant woman, take a knife, rip her open in the stomach, take the baby out, kill the mother, then kill the baby. So when you consider what the Jews were up against, they were not being vindictive and cruel. They knew what those people would do to them if they got the opportunity. Well, then in verses 7, 8, 9, and 10, the Jews killed the 10 sons of Haman. They've already killed Haman. Now they kill his 10 sons. Well, why kill the children? Because of their father. Children frequently grow up with the same hatred that their parents had. Now let me, and I don't want to debate, I don't want to argue, but why do some people turn out the way they turn out? I do not believe a 20-year-old can say, I robbed a bank because of my dad. I don't believe that at all. At some point, you become responsible for your actions. But it is a fact, children are not born hating. I'm going to pause and let that sink in. How many of you have ever met, don't raise your hand, but how many of you have ever met a little kid who was so bitter and full of hate, and even little kids wanting to kill other people? Were they born with that hatred? Were they born with that anger? Were they born with that desire to kill someone else? No, babies are born innocent. Where did they learn that behavior? Anybody think it was at home with their parents? Yeah, that's been proven over and over. Children who grow up in homes where hate is the predominant feeling, hate is the predominant attitude, those children will grow up full of hate and anger. Now, I grew up down in Tennessee. Don't hold that against me. Tennessee was one of those states that at least they've changed. But when I was growing up, a little kid, 5, 6 years old, I was taught, not by my parents. My parents were never like this. But I was taught by many others that blacks should be killed, tortured, drugged, tarred and feathered, and kicked out. My parents never had that attitude. In fact, quite the opposite. Dad would bring black soldiers, Korean soldiers, Japanese soldiers, American soldiers. I grew up not understanding that we all share one blood. But there were people, little kids, see a black person and think, I'm going to kill you when I get older. They grew up with hate and bitterness and anger and hostility. Where did they learn that? 9 times out of 10, they learned it from their parents. Why kill Haman's 10 sons? They grew up with a father who was so full of hate that he was willing to kill an entire nation of people. They grew up with prejudice. They grew up with an attitude of superiority. And they grew up where their dad was the second highest man in the country. And so there's some thoughts that maybe they had some expectation that we are going to take back Dad's position and we are going to get rid of Mordecai. Bible doesn't say that, but there's some historical and even observational ideas that support they could still become a major threat to the Jews. So let's take care of them while we're at it. Now, the Jews in verse 10, this is a very important phrase in verse 10. The Jews laid on the spoil, latter part of verse 10, on the spoil laid they not their hand. One of the things about war is that when you went in and conquered a people, you were free to take all of the spoils of war. Many, many examples in the Old Testament. Many examples. And when you conquer someone, looting, whatever you call it, you are free to take anything and everything they owned. It now becomes yours. But the Jews did not touch the spoils because their goal was not money. Their goal was survival. How many of you have heard the expression, follow the money? Most of you. Paul wrote in 1 Timothy 6:10, for the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, these are saved people, they have erred from the faith The love of money was so strong that we find out that in Paul's letters, many of his co-workers departed from the faith because their love of money. And they pierced themselves through with many sorrows. Follow the money. I can't, and I didn't think of this earlier, I would have written it down, but I'm trying to think on the fly here. I can't even begin to tell you how many people that I have pastored over the years who were faithful, who were active in church, who were faithful in church, who stood for the truth, got a whiff of money, and it wasn't long till they were out of church, wanted nothing to do with church, wanted nothing to do with God. People are now beginning to go through my mind. We had one family that left the church because they got involved in, and I'm not against this company. They make some great products. I guess we don't use them, but they got involved in Amway. How many of you have heard of Amway? Most of you. And sure enough, they were very good at it. And they began rolling in money right and left. Next thing you know, they're telling me, you know what? And by this time, they were pretty high up in Amway. You know what? We're going to have to quit church because, Sundays is when we have our Amway conventions. Sunday is when we have our Amway meetings. And we're making a ton of money through Amway. So we won't be back at church. I have seen that over and over and over and over and over. Well, preacher, I got a job offer. They're wanting me to they're opening a new plant in Carlisle. Is Carlisle in Kentucky or Ohio? Kentucky? Ohio. They're opening a brand new plant. They want me to go and be the general manager of that whole plant. And I'll be making $300,000 a year. Unfortunately, with all of my responsibilities, we won't be back to church. I got a letter just, I don't know if it was last week or a week before. This guy moved, and he's a preacher of all things. He moved. After he moved, he thought, oh, now that I've moved, I need to find a church. And it's like, do you know of any churches in this area? And it's like, that should have been the very first thing you thought about before you took the job transferred. Follow the money. I remember hearing someone say, every man has his price. In other words, the best of men can be bought with enough money. Well, the Jews did what they did, and it was not because of money. They did it for life and for freedom. Throughout history, many Christians have suffered physically and financially because they could not be bought, because they would not compromise on the Word of God. Now, there is a Christian organization, and I'm going to put a plug in for them. My wife and I support them personally, and I'm not asking the church to, but we support them personally. As a church, I have called them many times for advice. They're called the Christian Law Association, and they will defend a church without charge. They don't charge any church or any individual who is being wrongfully punished for following their convictions. I get their newsletter every month, and every month they'll have a list of prayer requests. A teacher was fired from teaching because she put a Bible verse on her desk. Another teacher was fired because she put a Bible verse on her wall. Oh, that doesn't happen in America. Oh, yes, it does. A man was fired from work because he refused during break, which is your free time, during break, during lunch, he would read his Bible, and they said, you either quit reading your Bible or you're fired. He said, I will not quit reading my Bible. They fired him. He called CLA. They threatened to sue the company. They showed him the law where he was fired without cause, and he got his job back thanks to CLA. They do that every single day because Christians all over America say, I will not give up my Bible. I will not give up my dedication to God for a job. I don't care what the job is. I will put God first. The Jews were not interested in money. They were interested in standing for their lives, and they were interested in making sure that nothing they did had the appearance of greed. And you know what? They won hands down. We'll look at that in more detail next week. Also, next week, we will look at some questionable actions by Esther. Then I plan to look at the far-reaching results of Haman and his hatred.